welcome to Dip In and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate today to be sitting down with Anne Dix. Anne is many things, but one thing she is an author, and she has written a fabulous book called Little Mouse Finds a Safe Place. And it's very much to do with helping people through domestically abusive situations, how to process things in group and in individual settings. And I think over to Anne to explain a bit more about the book and everything else she does.
Hi, thank you very much, Lucy, for having me and my good friend, Little Mouse, who I'll be talking a little bit more about. So I'm a drama therapist. I've been a drama therapist since the 1990s, which is a very long time ago, working with children. I originally trained as a teacher, a drama and dance teacher, and then went to work in a children's home where I taught drama in inverted commas and discovered drama therapy and the difference between the two, and worked with really kind of very vulnerable and damaged young people, and then kind of did various steps and ended up working in a community team, a multi-agency team in the community in Leeds. And that was really where I became interested in domestic abuse, because so many of our families were experiencing it, and so many of our children, and perhaps the schools didn't know, they weren't aware, or families didn't want to talk about it. And so gradually we realized, and some colleagues of mine ran a group for adults. And after I'd been made redundant, with the whole team was made redundant, I went to work for North Point in the centre of Leeds as a school therapist. I was able to begin to develop a group for children, because we know that children are victims too. They're not just bystanders. And it seemed really important to find something to say the things I wanted to say with children. And I looked around, and there were one or two books. I think there are one or two more now. But when I was looking in kind of 2013, there weren't very many books. And the ones that there were American, and they didn't say what I wanted to say. And I didn't think they necessarily translated to the children in Leeds that I was coming across. So I wrote a story called Little Mouse Finds a Safe Place, as you do. And I so that I could use it with children. And I started to use it with children, and I had this little thought in my head of maybe I could get this published, but that seemed like a bit of a dream, and it's a difficult thing to do. But I approached Worth Publishing, and they took it on. So this is the book. This is the story of Little Mouse and his mum. It's a story which you can read to children. I've read it to parents. I think therapists can read it. It can be read in schools. It's not a bedtime story, probably, unless you really kind of know your child.
Yeah.
It's never going to be a Booker winner, I don't think, on the bestseller list. But it's a story that says the sorts of things that I wanted to say to children, so that children could think about what was happening to them and talk about it in the context of Little Mouse. And I chose Little Mouse because I was in a toy shop in Harrogate one day, and I found this little soft puppet. It's from the Puppet Company. And this is one of the originals. And it's something kind of squashy and quite sweet and vulnerable about it. He's quite chunky and appealing.
Yes,
very, very cute. So he became the hero, and it was really important that I had a male hero. And I know there's a lot of research that says most characters in children's storybooks are male, but it seemed important because I wanted Little Mouse to be able to cry, and I wanted Little Mouse to be able to struggle to talk about things, and to get into fights and get into trouble, and do all of those things that all the children that a lot of the children that I've worked with over the years have done and been in trouble for. So that was why he became male, and he lives with his mum and mum's partner. And the story starts in a safe place. But it starts and finishes in the same place, but it starts and finishes in a safe place. And the main part of the story is Little Mouse remembering, because I wanted children to feel safe I wanted it to not be re-traumatizing.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. That's so important to mention, actually. Yeah, definitely.
and that was really important. So I trialed this out with children. I talked to other therapists about it. We talked a lot about attachment and trauma and desperate, and certainly not re-traumatizing children. So he begins with his mum when they've escaped and they're in a safe place. They're in a shed with nice soft hair, and they wake up the next morning and he can see his mum breathing and he can smell her, and it's a safe place. And then he remembers what's led them to that place, and that's the story of mum finding a boyfriend, the big grey mouse, and first of all he likes him, and then the big grey mouse trips him up, or he gets him into trouble, and little mouse is a bit unsure, and he hears things that he can't explain, he doesn't have the words for. People in school keep asking him if he's okay, but he just says yes because he's frightened of saying anything. He trips people up, he hurts people in the playground, he runs about and overturns things, and is sometimes really quite naughty, but he's upset. And eventually he confronts the big grey mouse. The big grey mouse, he hears a noise and he goes downstairs, and the big grey mouse is pulling mum's whiskers, and he shouts, "Go away, we don't want to live with a rat anymore." And mum is horrified and sort of pulls him behind her to protect him, and then mum says, "No, we don't want to stay here, we're going," and they run. And I talked a lot about that to other therapists, because obviously I would never say to a child, confront your abuser.
Yeah,
That would be a
exactly.
very scary and foolish thing to do, really. But this story is actually based on a story that a mum told me about her son, and that happened. So it's actually based on a true story. Um, but obviously it's about mice.
Yeah,
Um,
but so much of when people say truth is stranger than fiction,
yeah,
then that's
yeah,
when you realize that some children will feel that compelling kind of need to
yeah,
confront,
yeah,
because children are very black and white, aren't they? There's right and there's wrong, and if somebody is doing something wrong, then we're bringing children
yeah,
up to say,
yeah,
actually, if you see something at school that's wrong, then bring it
yeah,
up. Same
yeah.
as at home. It is more difficult at home, though, isn't it? That's the tricky
Yes.
part.
Yeah. It is. It's, I mean, and obviously every case is different, and
Yeah.
it's very, very complicated. But I was training some therapists the other day, and one of them told a story, and I was really touched that he felt able to share it within a group, about a family member that he was aware of, who had fantasized about all the things she could do to her mum's abuser. Never did, never said anything, but that was part of the fantasy, and he shared that, and we talked as a group of therapists about what that might be like for a child. And I think a lot of fairy stories, but a lot of children's stories are about a fantasy, aren't they, of what
They
it would be
are.
like to be in a world without adults
Well, that's
or
it,
whatever.
and that's why children relate to animals. I was trying to think of the
Yeah.
series of books when my sister was younger, The Garden Gang, I think it was, and it was all vegetables that
Yes.
Lucy Leak and that kind of thing. I remember those, and children do relate to things in a way. If it's put into that kind of context, then they can say, well, I know it's not me, but I relate to elements of that. So it's not a sort of
Yeah.
pointing the finger saying, this is you, this is your life, and this is what you're going through, but it's also saying, but maybe you recognize things in there, maybe you see things that you don't like, that well,
Yeah.
yeah, I do that, I do upturn tables and I do trip people up. And I just think, and there is the important thing I think to mention is there's so little out there in terms of stories around domestic abuse for children. There's a lot of resources, there's lots of handbooks, there's lots of exercises you can do, all those kind of things when people work with children and young people. But to actually have a book that is relatable and understandable and not done in such a way that it's too confusing, it's beautifully done. And I think that is so important, because there isn't enough out there for people
No.
to be able to access. And that, because unfortunately, and one of the many reasons I started the podcast was because I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted it to be that you can have a conversation around domestic abuse, and it isn't going to be a kind of hushed whispers in the shadows. Let's not talk about that, because it's a taboo subject. Actually, it's a subject that affects many, many, many people, and probably a lot more people than they actually realize themselves. People will say, well, that's not me, I would never let that happen to me, but potentially are going through it, but just don't recognize it because that's normal behavior. And I think that's why it is important to have stories like this, to have these conversations, to say, yeah, it is okay to talk about it. And yes, children are affected, very much so. And, it made me think a lot with the book around kind of post-separation abuse, which is something I work a lot with, and it's kind of my specialism. But it's that processing things after the event. So even if a partner comes into a child's life, if that relationship ends, and sometimes not just mom, dad as well, which, men and women, it can be very unfortunate. Then the child may end up in another situation where the parent is in another abusive relationship, because that pattern, that cycle of the control, of the trauma bonding, and a child is having to process that, well, that's normal behavior, that's a normal relationship. Whereas we know in the profession that it isn't a normal relationship, and it's very, very sad, and actually it has a lot of unpicking to do. But I just think it's fantastic that you've done something that is, and for everybody to know, where is it? Where can you find the book? You can find it on Amazon.
You can find it on Amazon. You can order it from bookshops, or you can order it from Worth Publishing.
Yeah.
So it is actually, it's on Gardeners, so you can order it from a local bookshop, but you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah, I love
easily.
that. And I think it's important, a lot of the time now there's a lot of work done within schools, i.e. outside, agencies and services going in and working with children. And again, you're right, schools need to be more aware of domestic abuse, how to broach a subject if they think a child is, because one thing that worries me is when a child maybe does act up, or whatever people want to call it, they may assume it's a personality disorder, or a behavior, but actually it can very easily be linked to an emotional response to something that is going on at home. And that's where it gets quite difficult and tricky, isn't it? Because maybe mom or dad don't want to talk about it, don't know what their experience is of abuse, because it's normal, again, as I say, to them. But getting this book out there for so many schools and people to see, it is something that does need to be discussed so much.
Yeah, one of the things that I found was that sometimes parents are reluctant to talk about it because they say, well, my child wasn't there, they were at their grand's, or they didn't hear, they were in another room. And I think my 30-odd, nearly 40 years of experience tells me that children know everything.
Oh, absolutely. That's such an important point to make. And that's an incredibly important point, because very often, and children I've worked with in the past, you're right, they do. And especially in this day and age with social media, with technology, phones that they have from quite young ages, they see, they hear a lot, they're dragged into things very often. And especially with post-separation abuse, the child becomes the pawn in, unfortunately, the perpetrator's game, in terms of control and possession. And children are very aware. And what the book does is it's explaining that there are safe places, you can have a safe place. And that's so hard. It's making me think of refuges and accommodation, where this book would be incredible for children and for parents and for the staff, to be able to access it, because
it opens up conversations, I think. And a few years ago I was running a group, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit about the group that's grown out of this in a minute. But I was running a group, and one of the children, before it was published, and I'd made little books of the story, and so each child took the story home. And I was also working with a mum, and she had said, oh yes, he's brought a story home, he's pinned it on his wall. And I said, have you read it? And she said no. And I said, well, maybe you could go home and read it when he's not there. It's on the bedroom wall, you can see it. And then you'll have some understanding, and that might be a way of beginning to have a conversation about some of the things that he's gone through. And she did, and she came back the following week and she said, "Yeah, I've read that story, and we have used it as a bedtime story. We've read it together, and we've talked about Little Mouse." Because I think the important thing is children can talk about Little Mouse and his friends and his mum and the big grey mouse. They don't have to talk about me.
Yes, yes,
They can
they can
talk about the
transport that
characters.
onto, yes, absolutely. Oh, that's again another brilliant point, because so often children, I read something the other day that a psychologist had said about, you know, when people and when society doesn't understand why a child loves both parents, so they can love a step parent, they can love, you know, their biological parents, and one of those parents could be a perpetrator, could be an abuser, but a child will focus on the good memories, because in essence, as a human being, what we all want is to believe the good in people. So a child in their innocence will think, but there must be good in there. And I do love them. They are my parent. And I think that's one of the hardest things to try and explain to people, is a child will love to us, maybe as they get older and things can change. And I've spoken to different people over the years where they go, actually, that behavior isn't acceptable to me. But when they're children, it's very, very hard for a child not to love both parents unconditionally, because they're children, and giving them that option to say, I'm not talking about me, you know, this is talking about Mouse, or this, you know, and Little Mouse said this and Little Mouse thinks this. Well, that then, like you say, opens up that gateway for them to have that conversation without feeling like they're kind of outing the parent as being abusive, you know, and it's giving them that level of protection that's so important. And children don't talk more often than not, because what's the biggest thing they're scared of? They're scared of getting in trouble.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, sometimes I think they're told not to say anything, but sometimes they just feel with a loyalty. I was just thinking as you were talking about it, about, because I've worked with primary school children, so sort of 7 to 10-year-olds, 7, 11ish. And there was a young man in one of those groups who idolized his father, who was the abuser. I never met Dad, but I think he must have been fairly wealthy. There was a lot of talk about gifts and presents and cars and lots and lots of things. Dad didn't live in the family home anymore. But at one point, when I was reading this story in the group, at the end, he said, "That's a bit like my mum. Sometimes I've gone into the kitchen and my mum's been crying, and she says, 'Oh, it's nothing.'" Because in the book, Little Mouse asks his mum why she's crying, and she said she's not crying, she's just got dust in her eyes. And he made that connection with the mouse. And I mean, I can't be 100% certain, but I think at that point he began to shift a little bit in his thinking, because I think he was very much identified with Dad. But I think he just began to see that Mum had been upset, and that there might be a reason for that. And we didn't explore that. I acknowledged that he'd said that, and that, you know, I'd heard him say that, but I didn't pick holes, because I'm not there to ask the children lots of questions. I'm not wanting them to tell me, unless they want to, personal details, because obviously there are other children in the group, and we're trying to hold some confidentiality.
Some level of order.
Yes, I don't want to know the ins and outs of everything, unless that's absolutely what they choose to tell me. And at that point, we might decide we talk to them at the end of the group in a more private space, or with a member of staff from school or whatever. But yeah, I think there was something for him then, that he made a connection. He made a connection with Little Mouse and Little Mouse's feelings, and he made a connection with what he was seeing from his mum, who was desperately trying to pretend that everything was okay. And
that's where the book,
something went on there.
And again, that is incredible, because especially, you know, there are very strong bonds, and very often you do find with boys in particular that they are very much kind of like idolized Dad, which you know, boys who aren't experiencing domestic abuse or aren't living in a house where domestic abuse occurs, they idolize Dad. You know, they want to emulate them, they want to be like Dad. And I think having something where it's not so in your face that it's obvious, but it's enough that you can relate, and a child can relate to it and say, oh, actually, I've seen Mum do that, or I've seen, you know, and well, maybe that's why, because children as well, as much as they're very innocent, they can be quite selfish, can't they? It's all in their own world. They all live in their own little world. And, you know, if mum says, I've got some dust in my eye, oh, I've been chopping the onions, whatever it is. Then a child will go, oh, okay, and carry on playing, because in their mind, mum's reassured them everything's okay. But again, you know, for parents to read the book as well, and you know, for them to identify themselves through the characters, that's really powerful as well, because, you know, yes, essentially, obviously, like you say, you know, it is for everybody, the book, isn't it? It isn't just aimed directly at children. That's the beauty of it. It is a children's book, if you like, but parents can take, so grandparents, you know, friends who babysit and come and read the book and go, oh, actually, that's where it opens up. And I often say domestic abuse is very much, it's like spider effect, isn't it? It just keeps going and going in all directions. And that's where I think it's hard to explain to people sometimes that domestic abuse isn't just a certain demographic. It isn't just a certain area of society. Anybody can be a victim or survivor of domestic abuse. It can affect, you know, your family, your friends, your work colleagues. And having books like this is so important, that everybody knows you can get something out of it. And, you know, you might learn a little something along the way. That's what I love about it. And apart from this book, are there others?
Well, I have actually got this story written from mum's point of view. Can't find a publisher for it.
Right. Well, right.
So if anybody watching who'd like to publish this, that'd be great. But I've done it in the same style, so it's just from mum's point of view. And I've read it with therapists and given it to one or two people to go off and trial in different places. And the feedback's been good, because it's the same story, but it's from an adult's point of view. So there's slightly more detail in it. Which that's a kind of work in progress.
I love that. And again, because it needs to be a series then, doesn't it? And then cover parents and children, professionals, everybody. That's the beauty of it. And again, you know, it is so hard to find. You know, I'm just thinking of going into Waterstones, and you know, you're looking for books, and how often do you find something like this where you can actually say, okay, well, that's because very much, you know, so I was talking to somebody in another podcast recently about mental health, and I was saying to him that, you know, mental health, 10 years ago, if we talked about it, it's like no one talks about the mental health. No one talks about having, you know, depression or anxiety. That's something you go and do privately and go and speak to somebody. You don't announce it to the world. And again, you know, we need to have that out there in terms of domestic abuse, that we can talk about it. And that's, like I said earlier, it shouldn't be in the shadows. It shouldn't be a dirty secret, because it's not. And it's a conversation that if children at a very young age can access information like this and resources like this, they stand a much better chance of getting the help that they need before it gets to an age where, and I said this to somebody recently, that within a school setting, there's 30 children in a class. How many of those children, not to be depressing, but how many of those children potentially could be perpetrators themselves in the future, because it's never been identified and they just think that behavior is normal? How many of those children will end up as victims? Because again, they're people pleasers, they're empaths, they, you know, don't want to rock the boat. But if we have access to stories where you can identify and maybe think, but that's not normal behavior, then there is a chance of helping the next generation. Because I often say, I don't know, sort of our generations up until this point now, I think we're struggling, and we're looking for the support and trying to find the resources, which is why I've done the website I've done, so that there's resources of all kinds. But children do have a chance now, because we do have the ability to, through the internet, you know, they can, I've seen Little Mouse Finds a Safe Place, she talks about it on YouTube, you know, so if people are more visual in terms of, or audio or whatever, they can go onto YouTube and you break it down, don't you? Which is great.
And it's very hard to get Little Mouse into bookshops. I can walk into Waterstones, it's not going to be there. I occasionally go and look. And
I don't blame you.
Sometimes I go, you know, and I go and ask independent bookshops if they'd like to stock it. And sometimes they say, well, yes, they would. My local independent bookshop, I gave some copies. So Georgia at Imagined Things in Harrogate, I'll give her a shout out.
Oh, I
It's
love
fantastic.
it.
And she has it on the shelf, but I think it's probably the only bookshop in the country you can actually pick it off the shelf.
Oh,
And it would be great if it was there alongside, Badger's Parting Gifts and all those other wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful books that there are out there. It would be lovely, but that's quite hard. That's quite hard to do.
Mm.
But I'm ever hopeful. I've developed around this stuff. This story was kind of the basis for it. An 8-week group work program for primary school children.
Yes.
Um, for a small group of about 6 to 8 young people. All about Little Mouse. And so there's actually a Little Mouse, an unpublished Little Mouse story for each week, each session,
Wow. Oh,
which
I love that.
charts Little Mouse all the way through to from kind of being a bit confused and not quite sure and a bit unhappy and a bit overwhelmed with his feelings until we get to this story, which I think is week 5. And then we have a week where we think about him moving home and what that brings about. We have a week where he moves school and he
Oh,
makes a new friend and he meets Sorrel, who is my feisty little female
I
mouse
love
to
that.
balance.
I love
There's a
Sorrel.
Sorrel and Little Mouse, so Sorrel kind of figures towards the end of that, and all the way through to the final episode, which is called Big Voices, Little Voices, Big Voices, where he gets to sing in the choir. He gets to sing a solo because, having been thrown out of the choir for making too much noise and singing out of key, he learns to sing with everybody else, and everybody says how proud they are. And
Mm,
so it's a bit of a progression through the group, and the group lasts about an hour and a half. And I've run quite a few now,
yeah.
and they over an 8-week period. And just before Christmas, I trained North Point. North Point's an organisation in Leeds, has a lot of school therapists.
Yeah.
So I trained quite a few of their school therapists to run this. So hopefully it's going to roll out in some Leeds schools,
Oh,
which would be
that would
would be
be.
great. Would be great.
It would be amazing. And this is exactly what's needed, is in a way where it's done where it's familiar to children. So it's through storytelling, and what do all children love? Stories,
Yeah,
bedtime stories or
yeah,
stories around the table when they're coming from school. Sometimes they embellish their own stories of what happened at school that day, as children
yeah,
do. But stories are such a big part of a child's life. And I think, having that and accessible within schools where you can do that group work. And again, when you've just said now about the different elements of abuse. So for example, moving schools, one of the biggest things I found is the more often than not, it is the victim with the children who has to leave the area. Children start in a different school, as you say, they've got to start all over again, potentially, if they've maybe got through most of infants into juniors, that kind of thing. And it's a massive, massive
yeah,
step for them. And it can be a bit of a backwards step in terms of their confidence and their learning. Maybe they felt like they found their place in their previous school, and now they've got to, start all over again. And I think those are the kind of things that don't get discussed enough when
yeah,
people think, and people will say, and it's the classic and it's the age old saying, and I hope one day it's out the window. But when people say, well, you've left now, therefore that's it, you're home sailing, you've left the abuser, the children's safe, you're safe, everything's fine. And in so many of the episodes I've done of the podcast over the last nearly year have been around that conversation, saying actually that's when things get worse, that's when things escalate, that's when the perpetrator realizes they're losing control of their victims, whoever it is, partner, children.
yeah,
And that is where things do get really dangerous. And I think to highlight just how, on top of everything else, a child having to change schools amidst all of that they're going through and comparing themselves to their friends. Well, why isn't my friend having to deal with this? Why do I have to go off every other weekend, when I don't want to? And why do I have to spend half my holidays here, or X, Y, and Z over Christmases, etc.? It's so huge. And I think that's where breaking it down into different stories is so important, because there's so much to cover. And you're right, you know, the school aspect is massive. And children, if they get to access that within school, how many children will have maybe gone to that school as their new school and think, oh, I relate to that, I can totally relate to that, because you don't know what's going on at home. So yeah, it could be it could be absolutely huge if we can just get it out there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because the last group I ran, which was a couple of years ago now, was the group talked about Little Mouse, but they talked about how unfair it was Little Mouse and his mum had to move, and why have a big grey, and I knew they were talking about themselves,
Yeah,
because I knew a little bit about their background, but they kept it very much in the metaphor, they kept it very much in the story, but they were absolutely vehement about this was unfair, that they shouldn't have to move. Poor Little Mouse, he was having to go make new friends, you know, and the whole thing, and get used to a new school and a new house to live in, and the whole thing, and yeah, I thought, and I was running it with another therapist, and we just said afterwards, they've had that conversation. And also, I think the importance of the small group work is that they realize they're not alone. They are
yes,
not the only child. Although we're not saying, you know, stick a badge on you saying I've experienced domestic abuse. Within the context of that group, we make it as safe as we possibly can. They know they're not alone, and that this is an okay place to talk about things and share. And occasionally kids have shared really quite personal things about themselves, and feelings about themselves, and sadness that perhaps their dad didn't want to talk to them on the phone, or rejection and loss, and it's quite heartbreaking at times.
it is.
Really heartbreaking.
And that's why it needs to be in this kind of context as well, because it is such a conversation that, like I say, it is heartbreaking. You know, you're talking about innocent children that haven't done anything wrong, and they're just in the middle of this awful situation, and they haven't created the situation, and neither has the victim. It is all the perpetrator that has created the control and the manipulation and everything else that goes on. And I was just thinking then, when you were saying about, obviously it's helping the children to maybe identify their own kind of, that yes, it is unfair. Do you think, because obviously I wouldn't know, but do you think children in general, so if say the book was in schools in general for children who may be friends with, I know my daughter's a real empath. She really is. If she sees someone in need, she's there by the side in 2 minutes. You know, that's her kind of way, and that's just natural to her. And I think if children who are quite empathetic, and I know I said before children could be selfish, yes, of course they can, but we also have that, maybe
Yes.
have that natural ability to care, not just to walk past a situation and be the kind of good Samaritan, if you like. Do you think the book in general, for children to be able to either teachers to read it in schools, so that if they then think of, maybe their friends haven't, you know, disclosed that something's going on, it might be something that hasn't even been disclosed to the school, that if friends are there thinking, well, actually, I recognize that in my friend, that even, you know, those who aren't directly impacted by abuse, but those who are on the periphery, so say friends, for example, might be able to understand a bit more, so they can support their friends in school. I just thought, you know, because I think my daughter, if she read that, the first thing she would be thinking is, oh, that's terrible, you know, and she would want to help. And if she thought that, and some children are quite deep thinkers, you know, and if she thought that there was somebody that needed that extra little bit of support in school, you know, there's lots of little ambassadors in school, aren't there, where they're kind of, you know, to care for their friends. And I just wonder if it would be something that was really quite lovely for all children to know about, because then they can maybe start to understand what their friends are going through. It's just something I thought of then.
Yes, I mean, and yes, I think it would. I think anything that gives us a bit more understanding. And I think sometimes schools are quite fearful about talking about domestic abuse. I did some training with some teachers, and they said they would be much more happy to talk about bereavement with parents than they would about domestic abuse. So I think sometimes people are worried that's going to stir up a whole lot of things. I think sometimes parents, sometimes mums are really scared of that. Maybe children themselves occasionally. But then I think, well, you switch on the television and you watch EastEnders or
Absolutely.
whatever. There
Yeah.
are all sorts of things on television. So it's not as if they're protected from all of
No.
that. It's out there on television with seemingly real people doing really horrible things. So
Absolutely.
this is a book about mice, and it can be held in that story. So yes, because I think children take what they understand, or they take what they need. So I think when I've read this story in groups,
Mm.
some children have taken some bits and it's gone right over the top of other children because that's not been their experience.
Yes. Yeah,
So
because
it's
no two
not,
situations are the same, are they? Around
no,
domestic abuse,
yeah,
it varies widely. And I always say there's a definite thread that runs through, domestic abusive situations, but each one is unique to that person because their
yeah,
personality is unique. So
yeah,
how they react to situations and how they react to things that happen is going to be unique to them, and how they handle those
yeah,
situations. So I think it would be a really good resource in general
yeah,
because if we have, conversations now, we have Mental Health Awareness Week in school, we talk about mental health, we have all
yes,
these conversations. Why not have, I mean, that's just what I would like to see,
yeah.
a Domestic Abuse Awareness Week. Not sure many
Yeah,
teachers would agree with me, but again,
no, but
opening up that
yeah,
conversation and explaining why, or trying to explain why it isn't just something that happens to somebody else, or it happens,
yeah,
like you say, in an episode of EastEnders. Actually, it's real life, and it happens
yeah.
more prevalently than most people want to admit.
Well, sadly, I mean, I always begin my training, saying to people, look after yourselves, because there won't be anybody in this room who hasn't some experience, either personally
Yeah.
or a family member or a friend, or, because we all know, I know, you know, we all know people who've experienced it, and we might not choose to talk about it, but it's there. And I guess that's perhaps part of what gets in the way for some schools, and certainly not all schools. Some schools are absolutely superb about it, but I think that it's that fear of maybe that it opens something up for staff members as well, and that they're worried about how that might play out.
Yeah, that's the
And also you're trying to cram it into a very busy curriculum.
Well, that's the sad thing, isn't it? It is. But the awful truth is how many people are going to leave school,
Yeah,
primary, secondary,
yeah,
and be carrying this with them for the rest of their lives, which can lead to all kinds of other issues. I did an episode recently with a lady called Monica Lavich, and it was around, she's an alcohol and drug dependency specialist. And again, if a child doesn't feel that they can express themselves, then potentially in the future they're going to look for ways to soothe the problems that they've got. And because if they think they can't talk to people, or that nobody understands, then unfortunately there are potentially other risks involved. Or as awful is ending up with a perpetrator themselves, because they
yes,
think that that's the way a relationship should be, and that's how a relationship has always been in their eyes. And I do think, for me, it 100% should be part of the curriculum. It should be discussed, definitely. I mean, I don't know, but I would have thought, again, in another episode, I was talking to a lady called Rachel Lemon, and she's a coach, and we were talking about, where when we say we want domestic abuse to be out there and we want to talk about it, we want things to change. Well, things can only change if you go back and start helping the next generation. And I think I said, there was Desmond Tutu quote I loved, and it said, we need to stop jumping in the stream where we are and go back, to the source. And so in a way, maybe children knowing a bit more, year 6, in an age appropriate way, obviously, like you say, and the way you've done the book, but in a way that they could maybe understand. And with lockdown, with pressures of living crisis, with so many other things that, and I always say that's never an excuse for abuse. An abuser is an abuser, full stop. These things will escalate a situation, and they will make things worse. Just as drug and alcohol are not to blame for somebody being abusive, they're contributing factors, but an abuser chooses to abuse and control and manipulate and hurt their victims. So I think that very much, if children were maybe more aware from a younger age, there would be far less children then needing support well into their teens and beyond, having to try and process something that happened to them when they were children. And I just would love to see it as something that was in the curriculum, like you say, to have that conversation.
It seemed, I mean, that was one of the reasons why I chose Little Mouse. I wanted him to be a young male, and I wanted it to be for primary school children, because, you know, I'm never going to solve the problems of domestic abuse, but hopefully this makes a start. You've got to start somewhere. And so starting, my groups are mixed, boys, girls. Occasionally they've been single sex, but usually they're mixed. And because you get a really interesting interchange with primary school children who, you know, give their opinions very clearly about things. But it felt important to get in when they were young, and certainly in the group, perhaps less so in the story, but certainly within one of the other stories in the group work program, is Little Mouse gets very angry, and his dad, and I introduce a dad who's obviously left mum, who comes to collect him from school and takes him to the park and talks in an age appropriate way about how he used to be unpleasant to know and quick-tempered, and his mother, Little Mouse's mother, would say, you know, he wasn't a nice person to know, and how he'd managed to change because he'd thought about how he'd behaved. So Little Mouse can reflect on, yes, he remembers his birth dad being really frightening, and he doesn't want to be like that. He wants to have friends, and he wants to do this, so that you give the children the message that they are not their parents or partners, or they are not the abuser. They can be who they want to be. They can be loving and caring and have their own time. And towards the end in the group, we think about what they might be like as they grow up. How do they want people to think about them? What do they want to do? And we do quite a lot of because it's a kind of drama therapy group, I suppose. We do a lot of games, we do a lot of play, we do drawing, we do some worksheets, we talk about Little Mouse, and sometimes the children think about things to do. But we also do quite a lot of self-regulation, and we do kind of a bit of breathing and ways of calming down and thinking about when you feel like you're getting out of control. What can help? And there's one story where Little Mouse gets completely overwhelmed by all his feelings and runs out of school and yells at his mother and pushes her, and then runs and hides. So we skirt around child to parent violence.
I was just going to say, yes. Yeah.
Which, you know, I haven't got a lot of space to do that in, but we kind of consider it there. What does Little Mouse think he's doing? Is he right to do that? But Mum calms him down, and she reflects back to him all the different feelings he might have had until he feels calm, and then he comes out from the tree roots where he's been hiding, and she gives him a hug and picks the bits of dirt out of his fur. but it's so we kind of take some big issues, and try and look at them quite briefly, really, but in an age appropriate way.
And again, you know, a lot of people won't know that child to parent abuse is actually something that does occur. And at some point I'll have Michelle John, she's called, from PEGS, and that's a charity that works a lot around, well, that's their focus, is child to parent abuse. And again, you know, it's opening up those conversations and accepting that, as much as more often than not people don't want to know about it because it's too painful to think that your child might be, as I was saying before, you know, some children will leave school and in the future will be perpetrators. It's a terrible thing to think, but it is true. It will happen if we don't have these conversations and maybe highlight certain things so that children can get the support that they need. But yeah, child to parent abuse is another area that is becoming more and more talked about, but hadn't been for a long time. And you know, again, when I said about post-separation abuse before, that's something that is so, again, it is so common, but it doesn't get talked about. And these are the things that with the beauty is with the book is you can lead on to lots of different conversations. And it doesn't just have to be about that particular scene. That scene in the book might lead on to something else, which, and because children go off at tangents, you know, left, right and center, it may end up, they'll start off talking about one thing but then it'll lead into something much bigger because they feel as they've worked through that conversation that they're getting to what the real crux of the problem is, what the real heart of the concern is for them. And that's why I think it's such a fantastic book, because it's got so many uses. And yeah, it's amazing. You're
Thank you.
amazing.
And there are some suggestions in the back of questions to ask, or things that might lead into conversation, but also practical things. And one of the things that we do in the group, and I do on training, is we get a shoebox and we make a safe place for Little Mouse. And actually, in the group, every child gets their own little mouse, one of Little Mouse's cousins, to take home. But they create their own safe place, and that's absolutely fascinating to see what they do. And I think in general, most will put in a bed of some sort and comfortable, often as PlayStation and a drinks machine and a video game console and all of those kind of things. Food and drink and bedding are kind of essentials, but often there's bubble wrap in case a burglar breaks in, and so they can hear. Occasionally I've had children who completely sealed it with duct tape so nobody can get in. So you get an awful lot from a shoebox and a bit of junk, really. Just sort of stuff you might have, bit of tissue paper, buttons, stickers, whatever. And they build their own house. So there's one or two suggestions in the back for practical things you can do, because if the child can't talk about things, sometimes they can do them.
Yes, very much. And yeah, not all children are talkers, many are, but not all. And some prefer to, like you say, show you by kind of that symbolism of using the box. And sometimes by their actions, they're speaking volumes, aren't they, as you say, in terms of what may be going on. And I do always feel sorry for children who aren't. I was very much at school. I remember being told at secondary school, you need to be more emotive in your writing. And now I write blogs and I've learned very much over the years, but you have to find your passion, don't you? You have to, they say, write what you know. So you have to write about things you are passionate about. And I think for children to get to that point where they can open up about their emotions, I can identify as a child, I did not find it easy to express myself, because it was almost like giving a little bit of me away, and I wasn't quite willing to do that. It was making me vulnerable, and I wanted to have this facade of being quite strong and didn't need anybody's help, and I could do everything myself. Whereas actually, and a lot of children will give that bravado, but underneath, they want to express themselves. They just don't feel as though they can. So having these kind of group settings, having these exercises that you do, it's just so important. It really is. And I'm in awe of you, Anne. I am. I'm in awe. I'd love to try and write a book myself, but I just about get by writing my blogs. That's my limit, a few hundred words, and I'm like, well, that'll do. That'll do me. Oh, I can't thank you enough, Anne. Honestly, it is. And I was going to say, in the when I do put the podcast out, we can always put links to North Point or wherever you want, if you want some links put in, just to raise awareness as well, because it's so important. And obviously links to where you can find the book. And let's get it out there. But thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful. And hopefully I will see you again very soon.
That would be lovely. Thanks a lot, Lucy. Bye-bye.
Where